Hello, I'm Gray Kochhar-Lindgren, professor at Hong Kong University and the director of the Common Core. The Common Core is the required series of interdisciplinary courses that students have to take. They take 6 courses across 4 areas of inquiry: science and technological literacy, humanities, China, and global issues. And we've tied the Common Core into the SDGs coming out of the UN in order to help us think about how people, places, and the planet flourish. My 2 questions are, how are we going to change the structure of a university to serve individuals and the planet and localities in a much more astute way? I'm interested in taking student desire, articulating that across subjects, and figuring out how we can have high impact on their lives and on making each locality in which we live and the totality that we call the planet more thriving kind of experience. So what that's done is it makes us think about how to reorganize undergraduate curriculum and how to take curriculum beyond the classroom in different projects and different media, and to move the curriculum across disciplines in a very active manner. My own background is in interdisciplinary humanities, and I've learned over the years that project-based education is very powerful for students. And the way that they can work with each other across all the 10 faculties at Hong Kong U has been very inspiring for me and for my colleagues. I'll take a couple of examples about courses. One is my own course that I've taught called Mobile Identities, about local identities and global flows. And we had students do an experiential map of their neighborhoods, and people do not tend to think about their neighborhood. So when we had them do the map, whether it was drawing or videography, they had to go back and actually reacquaint themselves with where they live and how that experience structures all sorts of implications about their lives. Then we had students map a very local site in Hong Kong that indicates global flows. And so some used Central Market, some used PMQ, whatever. But we're trying to get them to think across scales of experience, from the very local to the planetary and the global, through the way the economy moves across the world. So that was a fascinating experience to be part of and to support their own development. We also do an annual transdisciplinary exchange with Utrecht University, in which students from both universities come together and create projects around what we're now calling the more than human city. We're interested in the more than human city from the idea of infrastructure, whether that's transportation or food systems, but also the microbial and the nanotechnological, and the way that we all live in this kind of socio-technical world, but we also want there to be kind of a poetic side to that in terms of how we improve the quality of experience with each other and with our local habitat and with our imaginations. So we talk about the city within the city within the city, and how we go about not just producing that, but imagining alternatives for ourselves. So we take this more than human city idea and we read texts from philosophers like Latour and Deleuze and Certeau, Donna Haraway, and we ask students to do a kind of deepening intellectual sophistication as part of their project, but also to do videos that they're producing as they go. So we embed videography tutorials in both the Hong Kong U and the Utrecht side of the experience. We have 160 courses across a wide array of topics, and so we've taken the UN SDGs and linked them, not with all of those courses, but with a set of those courses to form 2 transdisciplinary minors, one on sustaining cities, cultures, and the earth, and one on the universe and the question of meaning, because we're interested in how these philosophical questions intersect with questions of technology and demographics and statistics and aging. Again, how urban systems work, how urban-rural systems work in Hong Kong. So one of our courses is about this rural-urban exchange, and students go out to the rice paddies very close to Hong Kong and come back into the city with a kind of renewed vision of what a city is and how it depends on its surrounds. So we're trying to take these courses, open up the learning way beyond a traditional passivity. We're not at all interested in passive learning. We want students to take responsibility and ownership and in ways that make sense to that student, so that it's not an obligation, but it's kind of an opportunity for creative engagement. And we're trying to think of as many ways as we possibly can of moving that along and activating the learning. In addition to the classroom experience with these minors and the SDGs, we're creating Hong Kong learning partners so that both those learning organizations in Hong Kong can come visit with our students and tell them what they most need to know about the transition through and beyond the university. And we've created something called the Global Liberal Arts Design Experiment, which is tied into 60 universities worldwide so far, most of which are research-intensive universities that are hosting some form of the Common Core or integrated education. And so we're interested in these research-intensive situations, how the highest quality teaching and learning can, of course, continue to work, that gets linked to the research explicitly sometimes, but sometimes it's just the environment in which the learning occurs. So we're trying to figure out, okay, what kind of network can we produce so that we can have very modest, doable experiments between universities. For instance, virtual to virtual classroom experience. We're looking at women and innovation in different contexts, and we're looking at what this word transdisciplinarity means on the ground in a very modest way that we can articulate for students and the number of partners that we have across the city and a neighborhood and a street and a classroom and beyond. So my own interest is, as I said earlier, to really redesign the university, to redesign student experience so that we continue to have deeply held specializations, but as that expertise develops, also to develop a way of communicating across those differences, because it's always a task of translation, and letting people find out the amazing things they're doing. Universities can be places where it's very siloed, and in the Common Core I'm interested in providing a crossroads and a kind of a place where these currents can meet each other and take new shape and do new things in the world. So how can we create pockets of energy and articulations within the university structure that lead out sometimes in predictable but sometimes in not predictable ways, and so that we're not dealing with the divisions between faculties of business, medicine, law, philosophy, architecture, social sciences, but that we find places where they can meet and leverage each other's skills. So the Common Core is obviously just one example of where we can do this and how we can do this, but I think the university is moving along many different axes towards these kind of transformative moments. So many of our students come to the University of Hong Kong thinking that they're on a very straight and narrow path. They've been very good at taking exams, they're very smart, and they think that they're going to enter into a major, succeed there through very high grades, get a great job right out of the chute from the university, and then become a leader and just rise through the ranks of a company to be able to afford property in Hong Kong. This is not the way that I see a university education unfolding, and I think it's all to the good that the students will encounter both obstacles to that narrow fantasy of how the world works, as well as opportunities to reconfigure their imaginations and their skill sets to be ready not just to move out of the university, but to practice these things within the university as they move through that system. So they will all have a major. They will all be deepening their expertise in a certain field as they go. And I support that completely. As they're doing that, though, they're learning about different pathways and possibilities for themselves to take on building their own education. So they get to choose Common Core courses, they get to choose projects, they get to choose areas. So building their own education as they go towards something they're very interested in. So for instance, if they're taking a course in architecture and the landscape in the city, they get to go into the city and explore how natural ecosystems work in relationship to the built environment, in relationship to the economy, in relationship to what they want to contribute. And they'll come out having articulated a very small part of that. They're not going to solve all these problems, but they enter into the imaginative sphere of what it would be like to address one of the SDGs through this architecture, landscape, built environment, ecosystem course that already combines these topics, which very often they're not getting in their majors. So I'm trying to complement what they're doing in their specializations. They're learning about the poetic history of Chinese literature and how it hooks into social movements. And again, that allows them to think about how the arts enter into a kind of social political field and have an impact. This happens all over the world. There's a rich scenario of street art in Hong Kong. There's a rich history of art that takes on social responsibility, whether it's eco-art in Europe or in Hong Kong, whether it's street art trying to express some of our students' frustrations or their sense of possibility. But they get to think in these courses about these differences and similarities between politics, an economic scenario, how art can move through that and reconfigure our imaginations. And again, what they can do as a photographer, they take 4 million pictures a day, but they often don't think about that. What they can do as a photographer to shape that project, as a videographer, as a drawer, or just as a researcher. So in the best of the Common Core courses, they're forming project teams that are working together to try to address a question. Again, we don't expect them to solve the problems. That's not yet the task. But they begin to get a sense of the configuration of the problems, the limits of the problems, and they have fantastic imaginations once they allow themselves that freedom to imagine and to think a little bit differently out of that narrow slot of grade-determined success. We want them to do well. That matters in terms of other graduate programs or jobs, but we want them to really be in much closer touch with their own desire and with the way social systems work to give possibility and options for that desire, as well as limitations. As much as possible, we get them involved with organizations outside the university so they can get a real-world sense of, okay, here's how things operate. And it's not on grades anymore. It's not on a narrowness of responding to my problem set that's pre-established. They have to be very good communicators. They have to do research. And research is an absolutely fascinating term. How do we find out things in everyday life? How do we find out things about our exercise regimen day by day? How do we find out how the molecular somehow interacts with the cosmological? How do we find out about how politics and filmmaking and economics and the law intersect with each other? So once a student begins to allow themselves this possibility of an expanded field of experience as part of their university education, they're much more able to move towards something they're interested in. We don't know what type of job they will either get when they graduate, or more and more common, how they will help co-create their own pathway. These are not mutually exclusive options. But we want to give the students the skills to be the artist of their own life, so to speak. I want them to be able to communicate, collaborate, do critical thinking, make digital products. And I think this skill of making the digital is absolutely essential these days. It's not something I grew up with. I'm still very awkward at it, but I want to provide the platform for our students to learn as much about that as they can for every major. So out of all that experience, and facilitated by professors who can be design and program managers rather than simply lecturers, they're going to come out with the students will come out with a world of experience they can draw on. And they'll have networks that they can begin to enter into more deeply. And they'll have people they can talk with about, what do I do when I'm confused? What do I do when I want to make more money? How do we leverage this idea into a business? How do I contribute more to my community in Sham Shui Po? That's the kind of thing I want the university to be involved with, which it already is quite deeply, but I want the Common Core to contribute to those tasks. So it's really taking the old image of what a student does from I enter into the university, I'm in my major, I do my major, I'm successful, and then I move in a straight line out into either a company or graduate school or whatever, to a much more expansive, it's quasi-chaotic, but it's that much more exciting for the students if we can get them engaged in that task of reimagining what's to come and give them practice. I'm a huge believer in practice, and practice combined with theory, but give them thoughtful, reflective practice of doing these projects with each other and with experts in the field as they move. From my point of view, that gives them a much more exciting option for themselves and a way that they can really contribute to a company that they enter into, or to an NGO they enter into, or to starting their own art company. This very wide field. I want students to reimagine on what's possible, and it's not linear. There are lines that we follow. I need to know the history of philosophy. I need to know more and more and more about the history of philosophy, but then I don't know how that history will impact what I'm doing with projects on contagious cities or more than human cities, or with colleagues across the campus and beyond. So I want to participate with students in supporting that process for them. So we're all living in a very quickly changing world, and that's almost a cliche now, but we experience it day by day by day. In Hong Kong, we see restaurants come and go, we see our service providers come and go, we come and go in different ways. So the question about what the university will become and what the Common Core will become are extremely interesting to me. And you have to set a platform to begin that change, which I think we've done, but there's always much, much more to do. So how can we best serve the students and the university and our colleagues in a way that the paradigm of jobs is shifting incredibly rapidly, but that means that the paradigm of our everyday life is also shifting. And we have to think about pace and speed and acceleration, and not only sort of capitulate to the speed of social change. We have to have moments of resistance. We have to have moments of profound slowing down. There's movements of slow food and the slow professor. Thinking takes a lot of time. Projects take a lot of time. So I think we have to think about a rhythm of our lives and a rhythm of the university in order to think about what we might want to move towards in 5 years, knowing that we cannot predict that end point. We have to set the platform to provide all of us with the skills and the imagination and the capacity to respond to this pace of change, where not just the digital, but the globalized, the difference between cultures, the task of translation between languages and cultures and everyday habits, how all of this is happening at once. So one sort of master metaphor for this might be creative translation, so that not just linguistically, it's not a narrow language program, but in terms of life habits and lifestyle, how can we help each other develop that capacity. I'm a big believer in capacity expansion as a mode of learning and as a goal of learning. So in the Common Core, we've already developed GLADE, the Global Liberal Arts Design Experiments. We've already developed Hong Kong Learning Partners. We are moving more and more towards project-based learning with high impact for students and for communities in which they work. Next summer, we're developing something we're calling the China Liberal Arts Summer Session, where with mainland Chinese university partners, we'll offer Common Core courses in places like, we hope, Shenzhen, Shanghai, Beijing, so that we can learn from each other about what best to do in this kind of complex social, technical, poetic world. That will give us a ton of new information to be partnering with our mainland university collaborators on how best to do this kind of high impact learning for students. We had a conference called the C9+1 in April, where the C9 universities from the mainland came to Hong Kong, and we began a dialogue about what might work with the SDGs, with interdisciplinarity, with project-based learning. And we all want our students to learn to be interactive with these big questions, but the big questions have to be approached on a small, modest, scalable way. So what I hope to see in universities at large, and in the Common Core as a program, and in GLADE as a network of integrated learning systems, and in the relationships between education and the business environment, and the NGO environment, and the unknown, that we do not know what new social forms will come up next week or tomorrow, and we're all always adjusting to a kind of technological surge of a wave that we know how to surf when we do a search, but we don't quite know how to surf when it becomes the milieu in which we work. And it's not ever only technological. It's always techno-social. It's always techno-poetic. It's always technological. And so the university has a deep, profound responsibility to think about these questions not just from a profit orientation, although that's important in many, many contexts, but how these orientations can allow each of us individually and in social groups and as a species to have a shot not just at survival. We want the human experiment to continue on the planet, but how can we think about spaces of flourishing and thriving and really enjoying being with each other without being threatened by the profound anxiety of species, the end of species, or Antarctica melting and the rise of the oceans, or the massive gaps between the wealthy and the poor and how we navigate that. All of these things that many, many different organizations are trying to take on. But how do we make that a manageable project in a class, in a collaboration across continents virtually, and thinking about a new moment of utopian vision that we perhaps can do in cities between Hong Kong and Madrid, or Hong Kong and Seattle, or whatever our own networks provide for us. And how, as a student and as teachers and as institutions, can we think about making those networks visible earlier on in a student's career and enhancing the power, not as a cliche and not as a sort of a soundbite, but the power of these networks to actually make changes. And when you're in one of those networks, you know, without having to do surveys, without having to do quantified calculations of impact, you know that things are changing for the better. Change is a constant. This is existence, but changing in a certain direction towards a kind of flourishing. When I work with students on these transdisciplinary projects, Contagious Cities, or the More Than Human City, or working with classes, or working on cross-cultural group dynamics, which are extremely complicated and extremely interesting, I can see them change within the space, a very short space. And that space and time surprises them that they're able to make those changes. They start out anxious about those changes and not knowing how to proceed. So the task of a teacher these days, in my opinion, in a university, is to help students make this transition from anxiety and a lack of capacity to make connections through how do we begin to work together, how do we articulate those processes, how do we see how that changes, what the outcomes are, and how that all allows us to see the world and each other and our context much more clearly. How do we pay attention to the details that are right in front of us? How do we connect those details that are right in front of us, like our cell phones, our mobile phones, with the work going on around the world? So again, for me, it's developing scales, pathways, triggers, catalysts, and then what do we do with those? It's not easy because we're inventing it as we go. And that's why these kind of entrepreneurial disruption, and I dislike the word disruption in many, many, many ways. And but nonetheless, both on the technical side and the social side, we're living in this kind of transitional space. The transitional space gives us capacity to do things in a new way, and this is what artists and philosophers and entrepreneurs know how to do best, is create a new platform, to create a new series of possibilities. So I want all of my students to do that better, and I can see that happening only in these projects that they're doing in classes on cybersecurity and videography, or thinking about biometrics and the deep possibilities of that and the deep intrusiveness of that, or thinking about drones as ways of delivering medicine, or having a massive global surveillance system, or delivering missiles. So we're the ones that are trying to work to make out of these technologies and out of these new sociologies a new non-destructive, flourishing space. And this, as we all know, this is not a simple thing. There are many powers at work that want to do things in different ways. But I think for the university is how can I help myself, my colleagues, and my students align with the capacities they can start building as soon as they step on campus. Actually, before they step on campus, we do a lot of interviews with secondary school students. We're working with secondary schools and a program called Teaching by Design, about how design thinking, taken from design schools and architecture and IDEO, these companies that understand the kind of creativity from the ground up. How can we take that from secondary school through the university experience and beyond? I just think what I observe is that every student likes to be engaged. They often don't know that because it hasn't happened enough. But our responsibility is to engage them in things that are important, that they already care about, and how to expand that in terms of skills and connections and networks and that kind of thing. So I see the university in a very interesting position, and it has to change to meet the demands of the times, not as a passive recipient, but as a hugely important contributor to shaping those times of transition.